Hey, welcome to Reconstruction Part 2, The Oppression Strikes Persistently. In my previous lesson, I wasn't sure what I was going to call the opposing force or the sequel to Part 1, but we're going to go with The Oppression Strikes Persistently. So keeping in line with my Star Wars analogy, there is still definitely these opposing forces, and I want you to keep that in mind. But previously, I had presented that there was like the light side and the dark side, and they were going back and forth, and we're going to review that a little bit, but I also want to you to recognize that these other oppressive forces were happening at the same time. So here's my learning targets. We're going to review the general characterization of Reconstruction as the pro-black government force being undermined by the anti-black force. And the new additions, though, we want to understand and identify the additional persistent undermining forces of oppression. We want to understand why Reconstruction ends, okay? Because it ends. And I remember as a student, I was like, how does it end? Why does it just end? They were making all this progress and it just ends. And then I also still want you to think about this quote. So history does not repeat, but it does rhyme though, okay? And so we're going to just kind of continue to think about, how does history rhyme? All right, let's jump into some review, and we're going to add some new forces of oppression. So previously, I left you with this image, all right? Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, this pattern of undermining progress, okay? There's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and they're duking it out, and the whole reason they have to be passed is because there's these undermining forces at work. And so by the 15th Amendment, it was supposed to be this, like, they have citizenship, black people can vote, they are finally electing a whole bunch of people to office, but then what happens is, we need to add on to our understanding, is that Reconstruction is a pattern of undermining progress, and there are these additional persistent undermining forces of oppression. And if you need a definition of oppression, oppression is cruel, unjust, disadvantaged circumstance, okay? I'm calling it a circumstance or a situation because it is a long-term state of being, all right? In a long-term state of cruelty or unjustness or being disadvantaged. And that is what we're going to look at. So what are our forces of oppression? Violence, all right? Violence, number one. Number two, media propaganda. And number three, lack of opportunity. And then our really, really big kind of force of oppression is economic obstacles, because progress is just expensive. And by the end of it, all of these forces have kind of almost completely eclipsed all of the pro-black integration forces. All right, so let's start with violence. Racist violent suppression starts like really, really in force. And it's the beginning of our big white supremacist paramilitary, and I'm going to call them cults, like the KKK. And if you need a definition of paramilitary, it's an unofficial armed force. It's a terrorist gang. That's what a paramilitary is. It's a terrorist gang. So our probably most famous example is the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, which started in 1866. And that's only because they're famous because they're still active today with maybe a few thousand members. And it's because they come back like in the early 1900s and again, later 1900s. But there are other Reconstruction era paramilitary groups like the Knights of White Camellia, who is another group who said that they were fighting for religious rights and protecting things like that. The Red Shirts were former Confederate soldiers, and the White League, well, they're called the White League. So, like, yeah, they're obviously a white supremacist, like, paramilitary group. And the idea, though, is that large, overt, organized terror groups, although it started here, it was sort of suppressed early on. So there was a law that got passed that says it's illegal to be part of the KKK, and it got enforced sometimes. So that means that federal military presence, in conjunction with some of the other federal government laws, did manage to suppress and slow down some of the terrorist violence, but definitely not all of it. All right, so if we zoom in, I want to look at some of the earlier years. Monthly attacks on South Carolina freedmen, 1866 to 1868. Between October and November, I'm looking on the right side there, in 1868, there are innumerable attacks designed to intimidate black citizens out of voting and kill those who did. So to try to deter people from voting in that 1868 election, people would go out and actually just kill people. And so after the military shows up, after 1871, some of those violent and obvious attacks, they slowed down, but they're definitely not completely shut down. One of them here is in Colfax, Louisiana. So check out this monument that I just did a little bit of research. I think it's still there today. To the memory of the heroes Stephen Decatur Parrish, James Weston Knott, Sidney Harris, who fell in the Colfax riot fighting for white supremacy. Yay, white supremacy. Now we recognize this as the Colfax Massacre, and in 1873 there was a dispute over an election that resulted in a shootout between a black mob and a white mob, and eventually the blacks surrender, and then the whites, they still turn around and they murder 150 black people in Colfax, Louisiana, and yes, I think this monument is still there in the Colfax Cemetery. And then still a little bit later, this cartoon is from 1876, and you can see it's got white men pointing guns at a black voter. And so this is representative of there's still violence occurring. There's still voter suppression happening. And so there's still, I put in the blue box over there, underground violent cult activities. Like the KKK is still operating. They're just like not out and all over and obvious about it anymore. And so voter suppression is still definitely common through violence and intimidation. And there's still probably an occasional murder or two. There's a lot. There's still definitely a lot of murders. We'll learn about that in future lessons too. So even though it has subsided after 1868 and after 1870, it's still definitely there. So violence is still a really powerful force of oppression. All right, our next one, media propaganda. So persistent racist propaganda campaigns are happening the whole Reconstruction time. And there's a constant media being produced to vilify and dehumanize blacks and anybody who would support them, okay? And the idea was to make blacks look bad, stupid, incompetent, ignorant, and maybe scary. And the idea was people who would read these, they want to scare white people into still supporting white supremacy. And so one case here, if you look at, this is a picture from 1868, and you can look at the picture a little bit closer if you want to, but it's depicting the Congress of South Carolina. And it's saying that there are 63 members of the Congress, 50 of them are Negroes, and some parts that I didn't highlight, they can't read, but the parts that I did highlight here is that 19 of them pay taxes of a total of $146, and they have the power to tax you millions of dollars. So the idea that there are these black people in our government who can't even read, they don't pay taxes, and they're going to tax you was this idea to scare you from supporting them. So we know the Freedmen's Bureau is another one of those things that starts off early. And so this is a cartoon advertisement against the Freedmen's Bureau. So it says up here, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. And so again, I told you that they would make these this propaganda to dehumanize and make them look bad. And so you have here a freedman looking not great, and you've got a white man over here working. And so it's this idea that our hard work is paying for black people to be lazy and slackers. This is from 1874. And so there's 1874 up there. And this is another political cartoon showing a government where there are black congressmen. So remember, we know that between 1870 and 1873, a whole bunch of freedmen get elected to public office. And so this cartoon is depicting them again, not looking so great. And then you have these poor white people over here. Oh goodness, I can't govern because all of the yelling and the ignorance of the black congressmen. And that is a super racist mentality, and that is exactly the message that they were trying to get across. So again, this idea to make freedmen and make black people just look bad so that hopefully you'll support white supremacy. So media, another really powerful force of oppression. And then just generally a lack of opportunity. So even if you were a freedman and you lived in a community where, I don't know, people were relatively nice, you still just generally didn't have a lot of options. I was trying to find a statistic about this, but I couldn't. But I believe it's still something like 99% of freedmen, they still end up being servants or farm laborers for their former owner or maybe somebody else. And they do this through a system of sharecropping, which is still better than slavery. And generally, the freedmen, they would just rent land and supplies to farm on so that they could support themselves. And a lot of times, though, they would end up in debt. So it still gave them a little bit more freedom and opportunity. And I don't know, there was probably less beating and violence involved, but it still wasn't a super great situation. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau schools definitely probably created more opportunities for children in future generations, and there was probably some that could afford to get out. If you could afford to like move north or move west to become a cowboy or take advantage of the Homestead Act, maybe you were a little bit better off. I did find this statistic that by 1870, there are 30,000 African Americans that did manage to own land, and land ownership really was the key to getting out of oppression. Because if you could own land, you could build wealth, and only 1% of them, or less than 1% of them, actually did. So at the beginning of Reconstruction, when there was this big effort to redistribute land to the new freedmen, that really would have saved and helped out a lot of people, but it was a really, really big missed opportunity. So just general lack of opportunity, another kind of force of oppression. And then the really big one is just overall kind of like stacking economic struggles, okay? So Reconstruction efforts, they're expensive. Progress is expensive. So funding the Freedmen's Bureau, paying for schools, rebuilding infrastructure, paying for the military occupation, all of these things cost money. And there's a lot going on in the United States, and all of these things are gonna mean higher taxes, and people don't like taxes. And so there is just lack of popularity for Reconstruction. Something I don't really care that you know about, in 1863, there's a big economic situation, big economic crashes and panics. They happen all over the place in history. And I don't know, it's not that big a deal, or at least for my purposes. Unemployment does rise, and I just want to give you this example, though, that there are some other things going on, like the Indian Wars. So that is something that you do have a context for. In 1876 is Custer's Last Stand, or the Battle of Little Bighorn. And so headlines like this are popping up. Sioux Indians kill Custer. Massacre at Little Bighorn wipes out 276 United States cavalrymen. Chief Sitting Bull leads Indians in revolt as Sioux go on warpath. So these headlines are popping up all over the place, and there's a lot happening, and interest in Reconstruction, it just kind of fades. So what happens? How does all of this end up? Well, this persistent oppression stacked on with rising costs plus a fading kind of concern, it really just ends up in a disinterested government. And I know that sounds really sad, but that is the truth. Also keep in mind too, just because you were anti-slavery doesn't necessarily mean that you weren't pro-white supremacy. Some people had this feeling like, oh, we ended slavery, they'll figure the rest out on their own. And a lot of people up in the North, they were still probably pretty racist. And that is definitely a sentiment. So by late 1870s, the government just becomes less concerned because they've got a lot going on. They withdraw the military forces in 1877, and they just kind of give up Reconstruction. Part of the withdrawal is part of this compromise of 1877, and I don't care that you know so much about those details. I care more that you sort of understand the idea that there was this mounting lack of concern for Reconstruction because they were worried about other things. And so as the military pulls out, though, violent oppression increases. There's definitely way more voter suppression. There's definitely expansion and implementation of discriminatory laws. Black Congress people or government people are stopped or not elected anymore. 1881 is our last black senator. And by 1887, there are no blacks elected to any state or federal offices. So Reconstruction just sort of ends because the government loses interest in it. And this is my feeling, what? That's it? They gave up? And yeah, that's why Reconstruction ends, because that pro-black integration force, they just decided we did enough. We passed the 15th Amendment. And so our next lesson will focus on what does life look like when our pro-government force is not there anymore.